A few weeks ago, I published an episode that included a conversation on the Great March of Return along the Gaza-Israel border. The march, which officially consisted of protests from the end of March to mid-May, although protests have continued, has been part of a much larger conflict between Israel and the Palestinian authorities. After publishing this conversation, members of my audience expressed further interest in the topic. Taking this into account, I worked with Professor Tom Lynch, Professor Margaret Cleveland, and David Adesnik, the Director of Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, to set up this interview with Clifford D. the president and founder of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. In this conversation, we'll go in depth into not only the conflict that has occurred recently between Israel and Palestine, but the history behind it and how we got to where we are today. Stay tuned and keep listening for a direct, uncensored interview. I'm Luke Scorzel, and you are listening to Bills. Our guest today is the president and founder of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He obtained master's degrees from both the Columbia School of Journalism and Columbia School of Public and International Affairs. He has been an editor, reporter, and foreign correspondent at numerous major publications such as Newsweek, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and The Atlantic. Currently, he's the weekly foreign desk columnist at The Washington Times and the host of the Foreign Policy podcast. In February of this year, our guest testified before the Foreign Affairs Committee on Israel, the Palestinians, and the administration's peace plan. So today we welcome Clifford D. to the show. Thanks for coming on, Cliff.
It's good to be with you.
Before we get into the Palestinian-Israeli dispute and the protests earlier this year, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do and the work that you've done on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, as you know, Luke, I'm the president and the founder of something called the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. It's a think tank in Washington, D.C. Our focus here is, unlike some think tanks, we only focus on one thing. We don't focus on tax policy or healthcare. We focus only on national security policy. And that means we have experts, researchers, and others who are looking at various problems, issues, parts of the world, various subject matters such as economic sanctions and how that's done, legislation, all of that. We do research and we try to make our research actionable, which means that a legislator or a policymaker can utilize it in their work. That's important that it be useful. And a lot of really most of the work we do is what we would call demand side rather than supply side. Supply side means that the think tank has wonderful, smart people sitting in small cubicles, sucking their thumb, thinking great thoughts, writing great monographs, and hoping somebody reads them and does something with them. We have about 5,000 requests a year that come in from members of Congress, from people in the administration, from journalists and others, and we respond with research that is reliable, factual, fully footnoted, and that can help them do their jobs better. So we're essentially producing intellectual capital for others to spend.
Mm-hmm. So what is the story behind the founding of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies? Why did you start it?
So here's the story. I started it in September of 2001. And when I say that to people, they say, well, of course that's the case because of the attacks of 9/11, 2001. The interesting thing is that the first conversations I had about an organization like this took place about a week before the attacks of 9/11-01. And those conversations were with two people that some of your listeners may have heard of. If not, they should. One was Jeane Kirkpatrick. Jeane Kirkpatrick was a wonderful, brilliant woman, a stateswoman. She'd probably say a statesman because I don't think she cared about those kinds of labels. She was a Democrat who was brought into Ronald Reagan's administration and became his ambassador to the UN. And I believe she was not only the first woman ambassador to the UN from the U.S., but also the first ambassador who had cabinet status. She was a member of Ronald Reagan's cabinet as well. I knew her from my days reporting for the New York Times. The other person I spoke with was Jack Kemp. Again, someone people should know. He was a quarterback for the Buffalo Bills. He then became a congressman from Buffalo, New York. He at one point ran in the primaries for president, but was beaten by George H.W. Bush. That's when I first met him. I covered his campaign for the New York Times. He became Secretary of HUD. He also ran for the vice presidential spot under Bob Dole in a general election later. So I knew him as well. The two of them came to me, and essentially they said to me, here's what we want to talk about. We're concerned. We think America is taking a holiday from history. We think America is taking a peace dividend prematurely. Why do we think that? Because everybody seems to assume that because the Berlin Wall has fallen down and the Soviet Union is no more, we have no enemies. But we were attacked, and many American servicemen and women were killed in 1983 in Beirut. Who did that and why? We were attacked in New York City at the World Trade Center in 1993. Who did that and why? We were attacked in 1996 at Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia. Two of our embassies were blown up in 1998 in Africa. The USS Cole was attacked in 2000. I could go on with many other examples of this. They said, we don't see anybody connecting the dots, looking at why this is happening, who's responsible, what are the ideologies behind these terrorist attacks, what regimes, what groups. And initially all they said to me was, go out and tell us if anybody is seriously looking at these issues and trying to come up with policy options. And I began to do that, didn't get very far, and then the attacks of 9/11 happened. I met with them again. Essentially, I said, boy, what you feared and anticipated has now come to pass, hasn't it? They were also concerned, I should say, because we're going to talk about Israel, about what was happening in 2001 in Israel and to Israel. There was no security fence at that time, and Israel was getting hit by waves of suicide bombers. And they were disturbed, not just that this was happening, but that people were saying, well, people have grievances with Israel. Well, people have legitimate grievances with Israel. Their view was, I don't care what kind of grievance you have, legitimate or otherwise, that doesn't give you license to murder other people's children. And if they're doing that now and taking that attitude towards Israel, you think people don't have grievances, legitimate or not, with the United States? Won't we be the recipient of these kinds of attacks fairly soon? And again, that is what happened on 9/11. So after that, I talked with them, I worked with them, I looked at what was going on within the think tank community, within academia, and essentially I said, I don't think what you're talking about exists out there. They asked me to then give them a fairly lengthy memo on how an organization might be constructed to look at terrorism, the ideologies that drive and justify terrorism, the groups and regimes behind terrorism. I came up with a name, I came up with a mission statement, I came up with a business plan. They read it, they considered it, they said, this is good, this is what we had in mind. I said, I'm glad I could be helpful. And they said, no, don't go anywhere yet. We're not going to, this is too urgent. We're not spending 6 months looking for somebody to construct this little boutique think tank. We want you to do it, quit your job. And I thought about it for a while and discussed it with my wife and decided to do it. And there were a number of reasons why I thought I should. One is I was rather seized with these issues, as we say here in Washington. One reason, two people I know died on 9/11, one in New York, one in Washington. Another reason, in 1979, I was a young foreign correspondent. I was sent to Iran, where I covered the return of Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution, which was really an Islamic revolution and was meant to be a global revolution. I understood that at the time, and I understood over the years the extent to which the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran gave birth to all the Islamist and jihadist movements that were taking place around the world. In other words, although it was a revolution in Iran, which is Shia and Persian, in the Sunni Arab world, the response was to be galvanized. There were people saying, look at this. We now have the first modern state dedicated to a jihad against the infidels, against the West. And it's not Sunni. It's not Arabic. Where is our jihadi regime? It's meant to be the Saudis, but the Saudi princes are having too much fun skiing in Saint Moritz, shopping in Paris, and drinking whiskey with their infidel friends in Washington. We have to compete. We have to have our own jihad. And from that seed was born Al-Qaeda and eventually the Islamic State, which carved off from Al-Qaeda, and Al-Shabaab, and literally dozens of other organizations and groups around the world at this point that are openly committed to jihad. The sort of jihad, I would say, has two edges, one Sunni, one Shia. You have the Iranian, is the Islamic Republic of Iran, Iran's rulers, who I think are sorely oppressing the Iranian people. They are committed to jihad in the sense that was envisioned by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the leader of the Red Revolution, and he was as much of a jihadist as Osama bin Laden. So, for all these reasons, I said, fine, I'll do it. I had no idea what that entailed, but by January of 2002, I had a small organization up and running. We've been growing every year since in terms of capabilities, and I think we have a tremendously talented team now, who I'm happy to say is very much utilized by people on both sides of the aisle and by various administrations. And we're doing our best to seek to educate the political elites, but also the general public as much as we can about the reality of jihadism and Islamism and the threats that are posed to America, to Israel, and to other free nations and those who would like to be.
And today we're here specifically to talk about that threat to Israel that is coming from Palestine and Hamas. The history behind the conflict is pretty convoluted and complicated. I don't think many people really totally understand it, but it is very important for understanding the modern day conflict and violence that has occurred. And one of the most recent events has been the Great March of Return, organized by Palestinians and some would say Hamas behind it. So before we get into the Great March of Return, can you give us a brief history lesson on the at-large conflict between Israel and Palestine, maybe starting even before Israel's founding and then up to the establishment of Israel in 1948?
Yeah, well, there's only a few thousand years of history to go. But look, I think it's important to understand that if you look at the indigenous peoples of the Middle East, there are quite a few. The Jews certainly are one of the enduring indigenous peoples of the Middle East. The Jews rebelled against the Roman Empire. Many were slaughtered. The Jewish temple, center of the Jewish community, was destroyed. Jews were pushed into exile, though all did not leave the area that is now Israel. They never did, but of course many did. It was the great diaspora. You had Jews everywhere before long, from Spain to literally to China, and of course up into Europe. But Jews never accepted the idea that their land had been conquered, as I'm sure you know, as part of Jewish culture and Jewish religion. For 2,000 years, Jews would say every year, well, next year we'll be in Jerusalem. They always wanted to come back. The Zionist movement in the 19th century was comprised of people who said Jews are being oppressed and murdered pretty much everywhere, certainly everywhere in Europe. It's not going to end well. This was long before Nazi Germany. We need to go back to our homeland. We need to go back to Israel and reestablish ourselves there. You should know that the area that is now Israel was conquered by many different, I would say, empires and caliphs, certainly by the armies that sprung out of Arabia, Muslim armies that sprung out of Arabia just after Muhammad, just after the advent of Islam. These were great conquering armies, great conquering empires. They took over what is now Israel. They took over North Africa. They went deep into Spain and dominated what we now call Spain for hundreds of years. They also went in the other direction. They took over. The interesting thing is that these armies springing out of Arabia in the 7th century were really remarkable because they defeated the two great empires of the time, the Roman Empire, which was somewhat debilitated, and the Persian Empire to the east, which was quite strong. And eventually Islam penetrated all the way into what is now Pakistan and India and beyond, in places like the Philippines. There were various empires and caliphates over the years. The most important one of fairly recent time would have been the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire conquered what we now would say is Israel and the Palestinian territories from the Mamluks. The Mamluks were fascinating people. They had a caliphate based in Egypt, but it was much broader than that. The Mamluks were essentially slave soldiers who went on to be great conquerors. It's an odd thing, I know, but they were slave soldiers. Some of them were Turkic peoples. Some of them were Coptic Christians from Egypt who had been taken as slaves. Georgians, Greeks were among them. Albanians, South Slavs, very interesting. But they were defeated eventually in the 15th century by the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans were based in what is now Turkey. And for hundreds of years after that, they dominated. Now, what happened to the Ottoman Empire in World War I? The Ottoman Empire sided with the Germans. The Germans lost World War I. The Ottoman Empire in the early 1920s collapsed. Modern Turkey was born from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. But the rest of the Ottoman Empire, well, that was defeated by the British and to some extent the French. They were allies, and that included a great swath of the Middle East. About 75-80% of what is historically Palestine, and keep in mind it was rarely called Palestine during the Ottoman period. It was part of South Syria. Really, it wasn't divided up quite that way. The Mamluks didn't look at it that way. The Ottomans didn't. But that area, 75% of the kind of historic area of Palestine, we call the Mandate of Palestine, which the League of Nations gave to the British Empire after World War I, became what is now the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Why was that? Because the British were looking for rulers among the Arabs, had difficulty finding legitimate rulers. The Hashemites were the family, the clan that had ruled Mecca and Medina for many, many centuries, but they were pushed out by the Saudis. So the British set them up first as emirs. Eventually, they declared themselves king of what's called Jordan, what was called Transjordanian Palestine. Originally, Jordan was never a country; it's a river. 1947-48, as you probably know, the UN decided, okay, the remainder of this area, let's split into two states. One should be Jewish, because there was a Jewish population that, by the way, had been returning during the Ottoman period. There's a book, and people should read, published in 1876, Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, and it's about Jewish proto-Zionism. It's about English Jews who want to return to the Ottoman Empire, but to the area that was Israel, and in fact do so at the end of the book. I hope I'm not giving too much away. The plan the UN had to split what was left of that area of Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state was accepted by the Jewish community there. It was not accepted by the Arab community there. And so instead, when the British pulled out, the Jews there announced the independence of Israel. And all of the Arab states surrounding Israel, including Jordan, including Egypt, they all attacked and tried to destroy Israel entirely. Quite remarkably, the new young state of Israel survived that attack. And Israel was born. Now, in 1967, as you also may know, Israel fought another defensive war, the Six-Day War. And it took two territories that in 1948 had been, again, British territories, before that Ottoman territories. Gaza was conquered and administered after 1948 by the Egyptians. And what we now call the West Bank, the biblical names would be Judea and Samaria, including what we call East Jerusalem, that was occupied by the Jordanians. The Jordanians did not allow the Jews to worship there, and they desecrated religious sites there. But in the 1967 war, the Israelis took back both those territories. And the idea occurred, we could annex them, we could make them part of Israel, or what if we were to say, let's give the opportunity for there to be a Palestinian state in Gaza and in the West Bank. We could do that. Maybe that would be a two-state solution. Maybe that would work. And offers have been made on several occasions to Palestinian leaders, starting with Yasser Arafat, who's really the father of the Palestinian nation, to come to an agreement on that basis. Those offers have always been refused. In 2005, the Israelis pulled out of one of those territories unilaterally. That's Gaza. I think they thought in part, okay, maybe if the problem is that we occupy those territories, if the problem is not our very existence, then if we give up one, that gesture will be reciprocated. Maybe the Palestinians living in Gaza will turn that territory into Singapore, Hong Kong. They'll do wonderful things with it. We'll make peace. We'll have good relations, and then we can do something similar in the West Bank. But of course, that's not what happened. Hamas took over in what was virtually a civil war with Fatah, its rival. A lot of Fatah people were killed. Hamas is a jihadist, terrorist, Islamist organization, a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood and a violent branch. It refuses, Hamas does, to negotiate with Israelis. It rules out the idea of peace with Israelis. It is openly dedicated to the extermination of Israel and of Israelis. There's no question about that. And so that experiment that Israel tried, obviously, has not succeeded. And the various peace processes over the years have attempted to do something to make progress. I can't say they've been successful.
Now, has an official state of Palestine ever existed on the land that is now Israel, even before Israel was established in 1948?
No, there never was. And the people who, look, there were Arabs who came there, some of them a very long time ago, some of them much more recently when the Jews were building Tel Aviv as a city and when they were draining swamps, when they were beginning to create industry within what is now Israel. There were Arabs and others, people from other parts of the Ottoman Empire who came for jobs and work and opportunity and all that. But no, there was no Palestinian state. When I say that Arafat was the father of the Palestinian nation, I'm talking about in the 1960s. Prior to that, look at any Palestinian government office. You will not see a picture of a Palestinian leader that predates Arafat. There was, during World War II, a religious leader, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was appointed Grand Mufti, really, by the British. He was vehemently anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli. During World War II, he left Palestine and went to Berlin, where he was very close with Hitler and was responsible, among other things, for broadcasting Nazi propaganda into the Middle East and for recruiting Muslim troops for Hitler's armies in the Balkans, for example. He was something of a Palestinian leader, but a Palestinian more religious leader. There was no entity called Palestine. There was no state of Palestine that has never existed. Again, there's the British. Before that, there were the Ottomans. Before that, the Mamluks and various other caliphates and empires going back to the time of the Romans. The idea, I do think that it's fine for Palestinians to say we now identify as a nation. Israelis accept that. But they also want, in exchange for that acceptance, to there be Palestinian acceptance of the idea that there is a nation called Israel, a nation state called Israel, and there are Israelis, and that Israel be respected and its right to live be accepted. Hamas does not accept that at all. I would say that Fatah is ambivalent.
So all of this has culminated more recently with the Great March of Return, which began along the Israel-Gaza border earlier this year and has persisted, maybe unofficially, even to this week, I believe, with events culminating in more violence. So can you give us kind of the background on these protests and what exactly started them?
Hamas, from the very beginning, as I pointed out, Hamas began to try to take over Gaza in 2005 and succeeded by 2007, pushed out the Palestinian Authority for all intents and purposes, pushed out Fatah for all intents and purposes, and decided it was not going to try to be peaceful and prosperous. A security fence pretty quickly prevented most of Hamas's terrorists from getting into Israel, so they began to lob missiles into Israel. Israel developed Iron Dome, which can knock down missiles. It's costly to do. But I was in Israel during the 2014 war with Hamas in Gaza, and more than one occasion we had to go into shelters because missiles were in the air, and they were if they were not going to miss, they'd be shot down by Iron Dome. They did some damage, but the Israelis were successful in defending themselves. As missiles haven't worked, Hamas has tried other things, in particular terrorist tunnels. That was one of the reasons for the 2014 war with Gaza. The Hamas was building tunnels not just within Gaza, but from Gaza into Israel proper, with the idea that they would send terrorists through these tunnels to kill and kidnap Israelis. Those they kidnapped, they planned to drag down into the tunnels and hold hostage. The Israelis were able to prevent that, and they've come up with technology since that I think is finding tunnels as they're built, and the Israelis destroy them. Okay, so if you can't use missiles and you can't use tunnels, what can you do? Well, these so-called protests. This is Hamas getting out Palestinians from Gaza, probably about 10,000 maximum. That'd be the Israeli Defense Force estimate, I believe. And the idea is that they were going to push through the border between Israel and Gaza and come into Israel. There would be terrorists among them. We know there are terrorists among them. The Israelis did everything they could and have done everything they can to protect and defend their border, as they have, I think, an absolute right to do. Any nation has a right to defend its borders, particularly from those who are coming in to kill them. Now, what the Hamas would do, because they've been their practice for a long time, and they acknowledge this, is they use human shields. They push out, if they can, women and children in front of the terrorists. They burn tires, so it's hard for the Israelis to see who's coming. They hope the Israelis will wait too long, and they'll be able to get the terrorists in. We know, because Hamas admits it, that about 85% of those who have been killed in these so-called protests, which are really an attempt at invasion, are in fact Hamas warriors. That's what Hamas says. I'm not saying that no civilians are killed, but again, if you use civilians as human shields, the whole idea is that they will get killed. I don't think that Hamas was trying this for various reasons. If they could get in and kill Israelis, great. If not, if they got Palestinians killed, particularly women and children, they could use that as a public relations campaign. Say, look how terrible the Israelis are. They're killing us, even though all we're doing is peacefully protesting. From a public relations point of view, and I think Hamas is very good at fighting public relations war. They can get the sympathy of the world. They can say, see, all we're doing is peacefully protesting our plight. All of these people just want to come back to their homeland, and the Israelis won't let us, and they're killing us. Meanwhile, as you know, the so-called peaceful protesters, if they can't get in through the fence and through the Israeli fortifications, they're burning kites into the air and burning thousands of Israeli acres of crops. They're setting fire to birds, actually, or having birds carry burning materials back into Israel. They're trying everything they can, and as they attack Israel in these various ways, they continue to say, you see, we are the victims. We are the victims. And too many credulous people and too many enemies of Israel, too many people who dislike Jews say, yep, the poor Palestinians in Gaza, the Israelis they are at fault. Meanwhile, it is up to the Israelis to supply electricity to Gaza. The Israelis would like to help Gaza out of poverty. It is right now that there is electricity only about 4 hours a day in Gaza. That doesn't have to be the situation. They don't have sufficient clean water. That doesn't have to be the situation, but they'd have to stop making war against Israel in all these various ways. The Egyptians have been trying to bring about some kind of truce. I think they're largely succeeding. I can't be sure of that. This is not good for what Hamas is doing is not good for the people of Gaza. If their goal is to live a decent life and have their children live a decent life, if their only goal is to wipe out Israel, and they're willing to sacrifice generation after generation, and I think that is what Hamas is willing to do, then I guess they're doing what they think they need to do.
Mm-hmm. So you explicitly then believe that Hamas was behind organizing the protests?
No question about it. There's no, if you in Gaza, Hamas calls the shots, literally and figuratively. There are no independent civil organizations that can do this sort of thing unless Hamas approves of it. Either Hamas wants to do this or Hamas doesn't want to do this. It's really as simple as that, and I think that's understood, and that's why the Egyptians can probably work out a truce here. Because they are saying they talk to Hamas, even though Hamas doesn't really talk much with Israel, and say, look, the Israelis are going to, they're going to continue to retaliate. It's time this was over. We don't support this. We're not asking you to make peace with the Israelis, but a truce. It's time to give it a rest. That can be done only because Hamas calls the shots. There are some other groups in Gaza that are not as strong as Hamas, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It is supported by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Hamas also gets both funds and, I would say, instruction from Iran. There are no civil society groups that are dedicated to peace that could not exist. Hamas would not allow it. And there are no groups that can simply say, oh, let us protest our plight without permission from Hamas. So, yes, Hamas is responsible for what happens within Gaza, absolutely.
One interesting quote, and this is from the political leader of Hamas, quoted by the New York Times, was, "This blessed protest is national, peaceful, popular, and civilized." But then minutes later, he stated that guns, rockets, and attack tunnels were on hand if needed. I think we've already attributed maybe that the protests are not peaceful, but how does this signal maybe a step forward in how Hamas approaches the conflict? And then ultimately, if the protest is peaceful at its face, they say, but there's weapons behind it waiting to be used, then can it actually be considered a peaceful protest?
I don't think it can be considered a peaceful protest. We know that that Hamas warriors with weapons are in these crowds and are attempting to get through and kill Israelis. If they do that, they will consider it a great victory. The Israelis will have to retaliate, I think, fairly forcefully and massively. That'll be demanded by the population. So it's better if they do not succeed. The Israelis are doing their best. They're very careful. But they can't be 100%. Again, what we believe is that 85% of those who have been killed are terrorists carrying weapons who are coming into Israel to kill or kidnap Israelis. I listen. A peaceful protest could be useful if the outcome that was desired was some kind of reconciliation and a two-state solution. But Hamas rejects all of that. When Hamas talks about occupation, they're not talking about Gaza, which they rule. Israel no longer occupies. They're not talking about the West Bank, which, again, Israel took not from Palestinians, but from Jordan. Before that, it was under British rule. Before that, under Turkic Ottoman rule. They're talking about every inch of Israel, every single inch. Haifa, Tel Aviv, absolutely everything. It's very hard to. It's one of the great challenges for anybody talking about a peace process is what do you do about Hamas, which won't even consider the possibility of peaceful coexistence with the Israelis. Now, I don't think under Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, the head of Fatah and the PLO, I don't think he is prepared to make peace with the Israelis. I don't know who his successor will be. He's 82 years old. I don't know that his successor will be more willing to do so. But how you create peace when one side, and particularly Hamas, openly rejects the very possibility of peace, it seems to me an impossible task. The media and others who are calling these demonstrations peaceful protests are not telling the truth. And we have seen this in a lot of places in major media. I've seen it in the New Yorker, for goodness sake, where they talk about people peacefully protesting and being shot by Israelis. No, nobody who's peacefully protesting is being shot by Israelis. There's simply not a scintilla of evidence of that. You have people who are violating an international border, coming into Israel, doing so with tires burning to make it difficult for the Israelis to see. And as best the Israelis can see, they try to discriminate between those who have weapons and are coming to kill them and those who can be turned back in other ways, with without the use of force, or at least lethal force. The Israelis are trying. They understand the public relations battle that Hamas is trying to win. It's not easy to fight, and too much of the UN Human Rights Council in particular, are just blatantly anti-Israeli, and too much of the media is just either anti-Israeli or simply credulous.
And we see a lot of that. So the United Nations actually passed resolutions condemning Israel for the use of, quote, excessive force. They've also been accused of firing indiscriminately at protesters. And Amnesty International, one of several organizations, has called Israeli response to the protests disproportionate. I mean, it's hard to look at the pictures of the protests. There's smoke everywhere. You can almost feel tension in the air, and it would be hard to believe that Israel couldn't react in the way that they did. But do you believe that their response was justified?
I think their response was entirely justified. Every nation has the right to defend its borders. Israel has an absolute right of self-defense. If there's smoke in the air, it's because the Palestinians have been burning the tires to put smoke in the air. If there's tension, it's because Hamas is pushing people out to invade Israel and get themselves killed. The idea that Amnesty International can say the violence is disproportionate, first, that it's really a meaningless phrase. The Israelis could simply wipe out the 10,000 people who are at the border, or trying to cross the border, or approaching the border. They're not doing anything like that. They are not doing anything to anybody who doesn't cross into their territory with as they perceive it, violent or lethal intent. This is the usual knee-jerk reaction of groups like Amnesty International, which have a record of anti-Israelism going way back. And we can't any longer expect them to be fair to Israel.
And Israel also put out warnings, I believe, to the Palestinian people, saying to stay away from the border. I believe they flew airplanes over and dropped paper leaflets telling them to stay at a certain distance away, and if they did, then all else would be fine. So they were trying to prevent this peacefully, too, I believe.
The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, routinely do more than any military in the entire world to reduce what's called collateral damage, to prevent non-combatants from being hurt or killed. They go way out of their way to do that. No other army attempts to do that. And they are fighting an enemy, Hamas, which intentionally targets innocents, non-combatants, women and children. Intentionally, it does that. The Israelis go to great lengths. If they know that there is a weapons depot that they're, as they did sometimes in 2014 during that war or other wars they've had with Hamas in Gaza, they actually call people on the phone and say, you must leave this building. We don't want you to stay. We don't want you to be hurt. They may, what they call knock on the door, which means they drop things onto the building that are not bombs as a signal you have to get out. They drop leaflets as well. What Hamas will sometimes do is say, you can't leave. You have to stay. If you leave, we'll kill you. They have openly acknowledged they use women and children as human shields. Then when the Israelis strike those who are killed, Hamas says, look at what the Israelis have done to us. But under the most basic tenets of international law, using non-combatants as shields for your soldiers is a war crime. And it is Hamas that should be held accountable for these war crimes. But that is not the case.
And does this response, the knee-jerk response that you described, give Hamas more room to do things like this in the future that will then result in the deaths of more Palestinian civilians, as you've mentioned? So there's also been reports that they were paying the families of either injured or murdered people money for going out and being in the protests and being involved in making it look as though there were all of these people who so strongly opposed Israel.
Yes, absolutely. And to the extent that this kind of behavior is condoned by the UN, by the media and others, the message that Hamas receives is we should continue doing it. We're not going to pay a price for it, and we shouldn't settle with the Israelis. We shouldn't compromise. We shouldn't take less than everything. We should fight on. They're being encouraged. De facto, they are being encouraged to do that. They are being encouraged to see to it that Palestinians get killed, and to see to it that people in Gaza are living in poverty that is not necessary. If only the Gaza were ruled by people who wanted to get along with Israel, you would see the standard of living rise very, very rapidly. The Israelis would be very happy to make Gaza a prosperous place, and certainly a place that has electricity 24 hours a day, that has clean running water, that has sewage that's not being pumped into the Mediterranean. That's not good for Israel either, and its beaches. All of that could be cured very quickly, but Hamas has no interest in that kind of governance. Hamas is dedicated to one thing: the extermination, the annihilation of Israelis and of Israel. They should be getting no encouragement from the so-called international community. But as long as they do, they will continue to do what they're doing. And I think the international community deserves blame and for being complicit in that.
Mm-hmm. And we mentioned these atrocious living conditions. And one aspect that I believe you've mentioned before that perpetuates that is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. So you've brought up UNRWA in your podcast before, Foreign Policy. I believe you had it in your testimony before the Foreign Affairs Committee. Can you tell us what exactly UNRWA is, and why are they relevant in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute and larger conflict?
All the refugees in the world, and there are tens of millions of them at any one time, and have been certainly since World War II, since the formation of the UN. All of them are under the auspices of what's called the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and his staff, with one exception, and that exception is Palestinian refugees. And the result is that while the UN High Commissioner has resettled millions of refugees, gotten them citizenship, gotten them settled, gotten them new lives, either in various places, and has done some rather good job of that over the years. Ask yourself, UNRWA, which is responsible only for Palestinian refugees, how many refugees have they eliminated by resettling them? And the answer is zero. And in fact, they do something very strange. What UNRWA does is they count as refugees not only those who have fled the battlefields of the War of 1948 or the War of 1967, they count their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. The result is that they now count something like 5 million people as refugees, people who, A, have never set foot in Israel, and B, they're Palestinian refugees, but they're living in Palestine. They're living in Gaza. They're living in the West Bank. They're living in an area that we are told is part of a Palestinian state. If I'm an American living in America, how could I be a refugee? But this is what UNRWA does, and UNRWA also, too often, they deny this, but I think it's pretty clear, cooperates with Hamas in all sorts of ways, including poisoning the minds of these people who they care for against Israel. Now, this is what they've been doing for years. They've been making the refugee problem, quote unquote, worse and worse and worse, and using these people as pawns against Israel. And many of the people we're talking about who are protesting or are being pushed back into Israel, again, they were born in Gaza, which is Palestinian territory. The Israelis would agree to that at this point. And they're being called refugees. People talk about refugee camps in Gaza. Refugee camps in Gaza? Again, they're Palestinians in Palestine. Why not settle them into permanent residences? Now, actually, some of these refugee camps, you would never know if they're a refugee camp. They're simply called that. They're a housing development in Gaza or a housing development in someplace in the West Bank, but they are identified that way. And again, they get the support of UNRWA, which the U.S. contributes hundreds of billions of dollars to. The current administration is contributing somewhat less. And it's essentially a welfare program.
Now, you mentioned the amount of money that the U.S. is putting into this. And for people or listeners who might even be indifferent to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, UNRWA still has an impact on them. So how much money exactly has the United States spent over the years funding the United Nations Relief and Works Agency?
I don't know the exact figure off the top of my head. It's, of course, in the many billions of dollars over this time. But I don't recall the exact figure. Mm-hmm. But we listen. We should be. I'm not saying that we shouldn't give any money to UNRWA. I'm saying UNRWA's job. First of all, UNRWA needs to be clear how many people, although that they're talking about, actually are refugees who left with the area that is Israel during a time of war, and how many are simply their descendants. This is not the way this is defined anywhere else in the world, or by any other organization, or by the UN for any other conflict situation. Interestingly, that information exists. A report was done. It was the U.S. government has it. Under the Obama administration, it was marked for some reason classified. There's an effort being made to declassify it, so we know exactly. If we had to guess, we'd say there are about 30,000 actual refugees and about 5 million people who are simply related to those refugees.
So the question just becomes, why are there two different agencies in the United Nations for refugees, and one specifically focused on the Palestinians?
Well, it's political bias, but it's worse than that. It is, again, to keep these people in such a state that they can be used as pawns, as fodder in the ongoing war of attrition against Israel, so that you can send 10,000, which is a small number of the people in Gaza, to the border and say, invade this country and kill those who are there, their occupiers, and take back what is rightfully yours. UNRWA, the problem with UNRWA is not that they don't feed people, not that they don't create some health care, not that they don't provide welfare services. They do. But that's not what they should be doing. People should have jobs and lives. And by the way, some of the so-called refugees do have citizenship in not everywhere. Not every country will give Palestinians citizenship. Lebanon won't, for example. Qatar won't, I think. Kuwait won't, but Jordan does. There are a majority of the people in Jordan are what you would call Palestinian, because, again, Jordan is ruled by, again, a very moderate king, I would say, whose family originates in what is now Saudi Arabia. Most of the people he rules are Palestinians. And even those who fled from the two wars I mentioned, 48 and 67, to Jordan, many of them have Jordanian citizenship, yet under UNRWA's definition, they are still considered to be refugees. They are Palestinians in a country that is majority Palestinian. They have citizenship, and yet somehow they're still refugees. Why is that? Again, they're meant to be weaponized, to be used against Israel. UNRWA is at the very least complicit in this.
And the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has a different definition?
No, a High Commissioner for Refugees doesn't involve itself with Palestinians, but anywhere else in the world, you're a refugee if you fled from your country, and then they try to see what can they do. Can they get you citizenship? Can you go back and you get citizenship in another country? How can you lose? The High Commissioner for Refugees and his team want people not to be refugees an hour longer than is absolutely necessary. Mm-hmm. That's anywhere in the world, whether it's Myanmar, whether it's the people in Africa. But UNRWA has the opposite view. They want as many refugees as possible who are saying, we insist that we want to go and live in Israel and become the majority population there and push out the Israelis.
So coming to
20%, it's important for people to realize about 20% of Israel's population is minority. Most of the minority population, not all, there's many minorities there, but most are Arabs and Muslims. They are the Arabs and Muslims who did not involve themselves in the war in 1948. Often they came to the Israelis and said, we want to stay in our villages and we represent no threat to you. We're not going to fight you. And the Israelis said, well, then we don't have a problem. there wouldn't be 20% of the population of Israel that is Arab and Muslim and has Israeli citizenship, and not all, in many of these cases. If that were not the situation, you will not find a Jewish population in any of the more than 20 Arab countries that's anything like that large. As there are no viable, really, Jewish populations left in the Arab world. Although once upon a time, before 1948, for centuries and centuries and centuries, there were enormous Jewish populations in all throughout what we now call the Muslim world. Certainly, Egypt had a large Jewish population. Libya had a Jewish population, about a fourth. In 1945, probably a fourth of the people in Baghdad were Jews. There were about 100,000 Jews in 1979 when I was in Iran. Now today there's about 9,000. Where did the Jews go who were forced to flee these Muslim countries after World War II? And they were forced to flee, often with only the shirts on their backs. Well, a lot of them went to Israel. In fact, about half of Israel's population are people who are or descended from Jews of the Middle East, Jews from Muslim countries. They also were refugees. They are not refugees because Israel took them in and resettled them and gave them Israeli citizenship. But the number of Jews who were refugees after World War II and the number of Palestinians who were refugees is about comparable.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Palestinians have their land that they're essentially permanently settled on. So I guess the question would be, why wouldn't they just make that their permanent settlement, build up functioning communities, and really establish a country that could then be recognized by the rest of the world on the land that they have right now?
Well, if you're Hamas, the reason is that you believe, as a matter of religious conviction, that any land ever conquered by Muslims is an endowment from Allah to the Muslims for eternity. And it cannot be ruled by Jews or Christians or other infidels. It must be ruled by Muslims. And if you believe that, as Hamas does, you have two choices. You can do your duty and fight jihad against the infidels who are ruling on Muslim land, or you can shirk your duty and not fulfill your religious obligation. If you're more secular, it is possible to consider the possibility of Israel being a state with which you coexist. I would say also there are moderate Muslims who say, no, the Israelis have been here forever. We do not have to. The Jews have been here. We can coexist with them. I think Jordan has made peace with Israel. Egypt has made peace with Israel. The Bahrainis and the Saudis have essentially said we can live with one tiny, and it is tiny, Israel. People don't realize how small it is. One tiny corner of the Middle East, not being under Muslim rule. Let the Jews have a state. It shouldn't be a problem for us. And by the way, they would say from a religious point of view, the Muslims there are able to have mosques. Those mosques are not attacked. They are able to answer the call to prayer. No one interferes with them. It's okay. There are various interpretations of Islam, various readings of Scripture and the Hadith. Hamas takes a radical one. That's why I would call it jihadist and Islamist. I would say the Jordanian ruling family does not take that view. Otherwise, they could not have made peace with Israel. And there are plenty of others in the world, other Muslims, who see no reason not to be able to accept Israel. And yes, let the Palestinians have a state of their own, not just what is in Jordan, but also in the West Bank and in Gaza. And the Israelis have been for years willing to negotiate that possibility, but that must include the idea that a Palestinian state would live in peaceful coexistence with the Jewish state of Israel. And we have not gotten any Palestinian leader ever to explicitly accept that, even in theory.
And there have been many proposals over the years that would grant the Palestinians a large swath of land. I believe in 2000, Israel, Palestine, and the United States all met at Camp David and came up with a solution that was accepted by Israel, but the Palestinians refused. And then I believe you mentioned earlier in the show, in the 20th century, another solution that was, again, turned down by the Palestinians.
Yes, so there's been 3 or 4 occasions up to and including where the Palestinians were offered, Arafat was offered about 98% of the West Bank and all of Gaza, a capital in Jerusalem, and that was turned down. I think Arafat believed, and I think Mahmoud Abbas believes, I can't be the one who shakes hands with an Israeli leader and says the conflict is over. I will take whatever I can get and continue the fight from there. This is why the Israelis are so reluctant to and I think rightly so, to leave the West Bank. They believe that if they were to do so, it would be taken over by Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad fairly quickly. And then they would have another front on their hands. And this would be a more dangerous front than Gaza because you have highlands in the West Bank. You could lob mortars down on Ben Gurion Airport, on the major population centers. It would be a much bloodier fight to get that area back once you were attacked from the West Bank. And I think the Israelis believe it would be only a matter of time before they would be attacked, unless they had a complete settlement that ended the conflict. So when you have something like the BDS movement saying they have to, we want to see Israel punished until they end the occupation of the West Bank, they're not saying they want the end of the occupation to be accompanied by a peace treaty and peaceful coexistence. They just want Israel to surrender territory that would be used to kill Israelis and to increase the war against Israel. And the Israelis are, for the sake of better public relations, they're not going to sacrifice that much blood, especially when this is important to, I think, keep in mind too. Hamas is a problem, but the northern border is more of a problem because across the northern border in Lebanon you have Hezbollah, which is aligned and in fact is a proxy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's Shia. It also is totally committed to the full extermination of Israel. It has more than 100,000 missiles pointing at Israel right at this very moment. And meanwhile, you have Iranian troops, Hezbollah troops, Shia militia troops in Syria trying to set up with the Iranian forces another front against Israel. Israel is going to do its best, and I think it will take very many steps not to allow that to happen, but that's what Israel faces. Hamas, when Israel asks its enemies to line up in size order, Hamas is not the biggest enemy that Israel faces. It's rather small compared to Hezbollah and Iran.
Coming to the end here, is there a foreseeable end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in your opinion, or is this cycle just going to perpetuate endlessly?
Well, one would hope that at some point the Palestinians would be led by somebody who says it's enough fighting with Israel, it's enough sacrificing generations of Palestinians in a war that we're not going to win. And it would be helpful if the so-called international community would say you're not going to win a war of extermination. What you can have is a decent compromise solution that will help you after that. But we don't have such Palestinian leaders now. Arafat was not that. Mahmoud Abbas is 82. He's not. I don't think he's going to make peace. Hamas cannot do that. We don't know who follows Mahmoud Abbas. The succession is not by any means clear. I think there will be a fight for leadership when Abbas dies or retires or otherwise passes from the scene. The only good news is that it's pretty clear that Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, they face a real enemy in the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran is their existential enemy, and they are more at risk than Israel is because Israel does have the capability to defend itself in a way that they don't. They recognize that Israel is not their enemy. The Israelis are not going to put missiles in their capitals for no good reason. The Iranians would be very eager to wipe out the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and others. And I think actually these, as we call, they're not democratic, they're not free, but these more moderate Arab nations at this point would not like to see Israel exterminated because then they'd be left alone to face the Iranian regime, and they don't want that. And the good news is that I think the Saudis would like to see a Palestinian leader who would accept the idea that He can be the head of a Palestinian state if it just peacefully coexists with Israel and come to terms and make it happen. And I think the Saudis, among others, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Emiratis, would support that at this point. And that was not always the case. And that's sort of good news, but I don't see it happening until you get better Palestinian leadership. And I'm not sure how you get better Palestinian leadership dedicated to a Palestinian state that would not replace Israel, but that would coexist with Israel.
Well, thank you for coming on today, Cliff. And where can our audience find out a little bit more about you?
Our website is defenddemocracy.org. That's the best place. All our writings, all our research, all our publications can be found there. Our podcasts can be found there. My columns can be found there. That's probably the best place. I do write a weekly column for the Washington Times. It appears every Wednesday morning. It appears in the commentary section online. It's easier to get it online in most places than it is off the newsstand. I'm happy to have people look at that. My columns also appear on pundicity.com, which is a very good website that aggregates a lot of different things, but mostly defenddemocracy.org.
Well, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you, Luke. It's my pleasure.
And that was it for our interview with Clifford D. May, the founder and president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Be sure to tune in next week for our interview with Andrew Kessler, the founder of Slingshot Solutions, an organization looking at policy solutions to the opioid epidemic across the United States. In addition to that, I just interviewed Tom Brake, a member of British Parliament. That interview will be coming out within the next few weeks. Additionally, I interviewed Hilary Cash, the co-founder of Restart, which is a program for the treatment of internet and gaming addiction. Very interesting conversation coming up. A lot of interesting conversations and informative conversations in the near future for the podcast. So if you'd like to go over to theedgeofideas.com/subscribe and get notifications when those episodes come out, please do. Otherwise, head on over to iTunes and hit that subscribe button and leave a nice review. Always appreciate it. I put a lot of great work into these episodes, and I've been really happy with how they've turned out lately. So thank you for listening. Again, thank you to Zach for his tremendous $30 donation, to Mike and Julie for their $15 donation, to Tiana for her $15 donation, and to Michelle and Scott for their $10 donation. All very helpful. Has been greatly inspiring for the podcast. If you'd like to donate and support my show, then head on over to patreon.com/BillsWithLuke to get the full access to everything special and a nice sticker and the satisfaction of knowing that you are supporting Bills with Luke Scorzel. With that, I'll see you next week. I'm Luke Scorzel, and you are listening to Bills.